I would like to welcome Dr. Brian to us, and Brian is going to chat to us on the final days of the RIC and what happened to the people who were in the RIC. It's probably an area that we don't think about too much, that they were all families, they all had a hard time. Some of them were forced to emigrate, and some came home, probably some didn't. So without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Brian Hughes. I'm sure it will be very, very interesting, and Brian will be happy to take some questions at the end, as usual. So, Brian, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mary, for the introduction and for inviting me. And thanks to you all for coming out. It's very heartening to see such a big crowd for a talk on the RIC. Who'd have thought there was that much interest in the RIC? But there you go. So my aim here is to talk about the final months of the RIC and some of what happened to its members afterwards. The title probably should be on its aftermath and County Tipperary. It's not entirely focused on County Tipperary, but there will be a reasonable amount of Tipperary coverage, hopefully enough to whet the appetite. When the RIC faced its endgame in 1922, its membership, if we exclude the separate auxiliary division, was comprised of two main categories: the so-called Old RIC, the vast majority Irish-born men who joined the force up to 1919, and the so-called Black and Tans, here considered to be any man who joined after the 2nd of January 1920, mostly, though far from exclusively, British-born men. About 20% of recruits from January 1920 were Irish. You could possibly debate whether the Irish-born men count as Black and Tans or not, but in some ways that's a slightly arbitrary distinction. And there are good reasons to separate the two categories, and also good reasons why doing so is a little bit problematic. They were, after all, hired on the same terms and conditions. They weren't a separate force. I'll finish with some discussion based on material that I've gathered along with my colleague Dr. Sean Gannon as part of a new research project on an oral history of the Royal Irish Constabulary, which has been funded by the Royal Irish Academy and by Mary Immaculate College. And the aim of that project is to gather family histories from descendants of men who served in the RIC during its final years. So far, we've collected about 40 interviews. The vast majority of them were people who are on the island of Ireland, but there are a few others that we carried out over Zoom. 9 of them were our children of RIC men, much more grandchildren, about 20 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild and 1 great-nephew. I'm going to mostly talk about the interviews with children because it's kind of the ones we've been thinking about a little bit more recently. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of thinking about this stuff. It's very early days. But it's kind of an ongoing project. Time is our only enemy as far as collecting interviews go. But I'll just draw on some very early conclusions from some of that material. And I think this is material that can mirror what's found in the archival record, and I'll kind of start talking about stuff that's in the archival record and then move on to the oral history stuff. But I think the oral history stuff can complement and add to the documentary record, which has its limits, particularly after 1922. And I think it can also challenge some of the pervasive popular perceptions of the RIC, which tend to be dominated, and often justifiably, by reprisals and outrages carried out by Black and Tans and auxiliaries. But I think the project highlights some more complexity and some nuance. So we'll get to that in a little while. So to turn to the disbandment of the RIC first, it was first announced in January 1922 that the RIC would be disbanded. This wasn't inevitable under the terms of the treaty, but essentially there was no desire from the force itself to keep it going or to amalgamate it into a new Irish Free State force. By the 24th of January, the entire auxiliary division had departed Ireland. The regular RIC in the 26 counties that became the Irish Free State, which would have included Black and Tans, were first transferred to larger centres before being released in groups in a staggered fashion. British-born recruits generally went first, and all were reported to have left Ireland by mid-March 1922. The disbandment of the remaining Irish-born members was due to be completed by the 1st of April, but it ultimately took several months longer than that. The RIC had completely evacuated Limerick City in February 1922, for example. Barracks in Tipperary were taken over by contingents of IRA around the same time. These are some photographs from Tipperary Archives' own collections, which are available online, from the Ned O'Shea collection, and they show an armoured car leaving the barracks on Friar Street in Thurles on the 24th of February 1922, and then this is an IRA contingent marching into the barracks. So this is dated as the 24th of February, which is to say about the time the Limerick barracks were being evacuated as well. Barracks in Cork City, though, for example, weren't handed over until the 12th and 13th of April, and it was early May before many of the men who'd been stationed in East Cork had left. The process had been suspended and then resumed in mid-April, following concerns about the safety and family arrangements of disbanded men. And there was probably some good reason for this. So, for example, the last convoy of RIC to leave Tipperary on the 3rd of March 1922 for Gormanston Camp in County Meath was halted by an anti-treaty IRA roadblock, and 2 policemen were killed in an ensuing gunfight. Sergeant Edward McConnell from Tyrone, who joined the force in 1920, was also shot dead after a dance in Temple Moor on the 8th of April 1922. Just prior to his disbandment. By the 11th of May, it was reported that there were just under 2,000 men remaining in 4 disbandment centres in Southern Ireland. Disbandment of the force in Northern Ireland had been officially delayed. It was due to begin in May, or it began in May, I should say, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary was founded officially on the 1st of June 1922. There was then a contingent of RIC that remained in Dublin over the summer at Ship Street Barracks and at Dublin Castle as a Castle Guard company and a Castle Clerical company. There were also men in Gormanston Camp to the north of the city up until mid-August. So then at 12 o'clock on the 17th of August 1922, the new Civic Guard, later on Garda Síochána, took charge of Dublin Castle, and the RIC was, as the Irish Times put it, fairly disbanded and put into civil life. So this is Civic Guard under Michael Staines marching into Dublin Castle on the 17th of August. There was no direct handover from the RIC. It was actually an infantry, a regiment of the army that handed over the barracks to the Civic Guard. And the ceremony was informal and largely underwhelming. About 60 or 70 of the Civic Guard were said to be in uniform. Many of them weren't. And by the time they arrived, the RIC had already made a quiet exit in cabs and hackney cars. Essentially, the Civic Guard arrived in the afternoon, and the RIC had left already that morning. These are some men outside Ship Street Barracks dumping uniforms and carrying boxes of possessions away. The Irish Times suggested that many of the onlookers regarded the proceedings with a feeling of regret at the passing of what was admittedly the finest police force in the world. The Irish Times, or the Irish Independent, preferred to focus on the cheering crowds that greeted the Civic Guard as it marched into the castle. So an order of council signed by the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland announced 31st of August 1922 as the official date of disbandment. Under the terms of disbandment, members of the RIC, but not the auxiliaries who were hired part-time, or as temporary, I should say, rather than part-time, were awarded enhanced pensions. These pensions are referred to as compensation allowances, and they were calculated to account for the sudden loss of employment. A free railway warrant was also issued to allow travel to any destination in Ireland or Britain. A member who was obliged to move his home to another place in Ireland or anywhere outside of Ireland owing to molestation or danger or for any cause whatsoever, as it was put, was further entitled to a disturbance allowance, which was granted immediately as an advance subject to a liability to account for it later to a new body called the RIC Tribunal. The RIC Tribunal is tasked with administering the pensions and allowances awarded to disbanded men. And this all only applied to disbanded men specifically. If men who'd retired or resigned prior to this didn't get any of these extra benefits. By 1924, the tribunal had dealt with some 7,000 accounts for disturbance allowances. In some cases, they were asked to return them because they couldn't adequately account for having to leave or how they'd spent them, but actually they were quite generous in how they interpreted the rule. So most of those who got a disturbance allowance were allowed to keep it. As it was recognised that fresh employment will be hard to obtain, a disbanded member could apply to load a pension for 2 years to enable him to live and maintain his family without other employment. And this was again subject to approval by the RIC Tribunal. Similarly, it was possible with tribunal approval to commute a portion of a pension to emigrate beyond Britain and Ireland, or to establish a business, purchase a farm, or in some cases a house. Later on, the tribunal recognised that this wasn't always a good idea, because men were given money to establish businesses that they weren't well equipped to run successfully, or they'd no prior experience that would kind of guarantee them some level of success. But the tribunal ultimately considered 1,686 applications for emigration, approved over 1,500, and granted 1,269 home commutations. These were commutations for people who stayed in Britain, and this was chiefly from British enlistments, kind of former black and tans. The RIC Tribunal was further empowered to make recommendations for additional allowances in cases of exceptional hardship, and this formed a large bulk of its work. Between 1922 and 1924, the Tribunal dealt with thousands of requests for increased disturbance allowances or commutation of pensions. It also awarded over 1,200 grants for the re-establishment of men forced to leave their homes, whose personal effects had been damaged, stolen, or sold under forced sale, and recommended 727 more grants on grounds of hardship, or on other grounds of hardship which were undefined in the records. Separately, where a man was forced to leave home without his wife and children, he was entitled to a separation allowance for up to 3 months, and 886 of these were ultimately awarded. The RIC Tribunal admitted that the pensions awarded to disbanded men were not, in most cases, as they put it, or were in most cases insufficient in themselves to maintain men and their families. And the issue of the size, cost and responsibility of RIC pensions was an issue for decades, actually, particularly between London and Dublin. And while this was considered the most generous package of allowances of its kind at the time, there were also complaints in the House of Commons that the amounts awarded were insufficient, particularly as regards separation allowances. The Conservative MP, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Archer Shee, for example, insisted that the sum is totally inadequate. They all complained that they cannot possibly keep their wives and families on their pensions, plus only that amount of 3 shillings per day. It was 14 shillings per week for a man, 17 shillings 6 pence per week for a head constable, and 28 shillings per week for an officer. So it was graded based on rank and the number of children as well. The Irish Office set up accommodation bureau with headquarters in Chester to assist arriving ex-policemen to find suitable accommodation, and local police commissioners were asked to provide any assistance they could to those endeavouring to establish a new home in this country, as it was described. Housing whole families, however, was particularly problematic. In May 1922, then Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill, told the Commons that the Accommodation Bureau had no difficulty in securing accommodation at reasonable rates in any part of the country for single men and married couples, but there had been considerable difficulty in securing permanent accommodation for families with children. And as an emergency member, the government secured a boarding house in London. The RIC resettlement branch assisted over 1,400 men, mostly, it seems, British-born black and tans, to permanently leave Britain and Ireland and settle abroad. So the kind of nature of the work of the RIC Tribunal that I described does highlight many of the challenges facing disbanded men in May 1922. And it was similarly, the efforts the government were making was highlighted in Punch magazine in May 1922. Punch, not always particularly favourable to the Irish or Irish causes, but they highlighted the efforts, as I say, made by the government. And it's interesting, the RIC man is drawn up here as a very, tall, straight-shouldered, well-kept, well-groomed, respectable man with his family. The caption reads, "Many ex-members of the Royal Irish Constabulary are paying for their loyalty by exile from their homes under threat of death at the hands of fellow Irishmen. The British government are undertaking the removal expenses of married men and their families to any place in Great Britain or Ulster," and by that he means Northern Ireland. and providing them with assistance in finding suitable accommodation until such time as they can safely return to their homes or settle elsewhere. And as disbanded men gradually filtered out of their camps, Ireland was confronted, as it was later put, with the problem of the release into civil life of some 13,000 men, many unable to support themselves or their families indefinitely, and with few prospects, or certainly few immediate prospects. There was also a general economic depression and the so-called political situation in Ireland to exacerbate the problem. The Chief Secretary of Ireland, Sir Hammer Greenwood, was most apprehensive, as he put it, about the safety of RIC men returning to their homes. He'd been told on the 5th of April by the former police advisor in Ireland, Major Henry Hugh Tudor, that of the 13,000 disbanded men, over 1,300 were considered in special danger. But Tudor also considered that any man who served in the police force is in danger of murder in Ireland. Later that month, the RIC Deputy Inspector General Charles Walsh advised that the vast majority of both officers and men enlisted in Ireland will not be allowed on disbandment to remain in Ireland. They'll be compelled to leave the country, and it's anticipated that most of them will remove to Great Britain. Now, none of the worst of these predictions or fears actually came to pass, and the experiences were ultimately varied and often quite personal and individual. This is a rough chart based on the destinations available from surviving pension records, which are a bit patchy or incomplete, for Irish-born men disbanded from Tipperary North Riding. So Tipperary, for RIC purposes, was divided between a North Riding and a South Riding, as I'm sure many of you will know. So these are men disbanded in Tipperary North Riding. These are figures are based on material compiled by Dr. Sean Gannon, and they highlight the range of options that these men took. So out of a sample of 147, an immediate destination, an early destination after disbandment, is available for 137. The pension records where they survive only go as far as 1924, and as I say, they're quite patchy and incomplete. But only 33 of these men, which is about 24% of the 137, remained in the 26 counties that became the Irish Free State. Of these, a small majority, or a slight majority of 15, returned to their home county, while 12 went to another county in the Irish Free State. 6 of the 33 men remained in Tipperary. 1 in Thurles, which was Sergeant James Fox. He'd been disbanded on the 4th of April 1922. He'd been stationed in Roscrea. He had married a woman from South Tipperary in 1908. And this may explain why he chose to remain in Tipperary. At least initially, what he did after 1924 isn't recorded. This is the one page from the disbandment register. This was a list compiled by the authorities as men were being disbanded. So they divided them up into men who joined prior to July 1919 and then men who joined afterwards. And so it records names, their RIC number, their rank, and here is their compensation allowance, the amount that they were given. This ranges from, one of them, I think I can't really see it here, but he got about £87 was his compensation allowance. Some of the higher end, some of the offers got about £167, £168 per annum. This is recorded. This material is all available on Find My Past, but it's set up for genealogical research. So it's not very useful for the kind of research I'm trying to do, but it can be found. Actually, a number of those men on that list, again, you can't really see the names, but they'd served in Thurles specifically, but they'd all been stationed in North Tipperary when they were disbanded. One of the 137 died very shortly after disbandment. John Walsh, who was a farmer from Kerry before he joined the RIC in December 1899, had been promoted to sergeant in 1921, and he was disbanded on the 12th of April 1922, which is the same date as most of the men on this list. He'd spent his entire career stationed in Tipperary. In 1920, he was in Newport. On the 23rd of May, he was with his wife and 3 children in Newport when armed men called at the house. When Walsh reported to the front door, he was shot several times and killed. Apparently, no locals attended the removal of Walsh and an ex-serviceman who was killed in the area around the same time, similarly so, and no inquest was held as jurors refused to attend. And in the aftermath of the killing of Walsh, letters and posters were circulated in Newport calling on ex-RIC men and their families to leave the area. And this apparently had some success, as it was reported that several men living in the town quickly fled. And this is not an uncommon situation in different parts of the country, because disbanded men generally made easy targets. In a frustrated letter in March 1922, the British civil servant Andy Cope complained that the RIC are completely demoralised and dispirited and allow themselves to be robbed like sheep. And one of the reasons they wanted it done quickly was so that RIC men wouldn't be handing over arms to the IRA. Also, these disbandment centres were often places where prisoners had previously been detained, so not exactly ideal. In some localities, ex-policemen may also have fallen victim to IRA units seeking redemption for previous inactivity. In Galway, for example, the IRA's officer in charge of evacuation of barracks complained about men taking shots at RIC men who, if they'd been as willing to attack, he basically said, "I feel certain that if those activities were so prevalent during the period of hostilities as they are now, much better results would have been obtained." Across Sligo, where there'd been a quiet enough war of independence, Michael Farry found what he described as a campaign of intimidation against ex-members of the RIC. In Cavan, where there are only 9 recorded homicides up to December 1921, and only one of those was a member of the RIC, the County Town's IRA raided the homes of the county inspector, a district inspector, and 2 ex-sergeants over the course of one night in May 1922. And later that month it was reported that 5 ex-policemen in Belturbet were threatened and fled, leaving their families behind awaiting suitable accommodation. Ex-RIC in Black and Tans in Killashandra and elsewhere were reported to have been given a few days to clear out. And in addition to RIC men killed while still in the force in late 1921 and early 1922, at least 15 were killed after they'd been disbanded in the 26 counties in 1922. So John Walsh was one of the 15. More of the men disbanded in North Tipperary went to Britain than remained in the Irish Free State. And 44 in total of the 137, or 32%. Another 37 or 27%, this is of the 137, are recorded in a destination outside Ireland and Britain, most in the United States or Palestine, with a small number in Australia or New Zealand. A total of 26 of these men went to Palestine in 1922 to form part of the British section of the Palestine Gendarmerie, which was set up in 1922 and made up initially of 760 men, almost all of whom were ex-RIC or ex-auxiliaries. They arrived at Haifa in Palestine in April 1922 under the command of General Hugh Tudor. This section of the Palestine Police was disbanded in 1926, and some of its Irish-born members continued policing careers elsewhere in the Empire, and Sean Gannon's work on this is very good. Of the 22 men who went to the 6 counties that became Northern Ireland on disbandment, more than half, or 13 of them, joined the new Royal Ulster Constabulary. British police forces were unwilling to take on ex-RIC men, partly for pension considerations and partly because they didn't think the kind of service they had in Ireland was suitable for policing in Britain. So the RUC, or colonial police forces, were the options available to men who wanted or felt they needed to continue a career in policing. About 1,300 disbanded RIC men joined the RUC. The estimate is about 500 of those were Catholics. And the majority of the 760-strong Palestine Gendarmerie, as I said, was made up of ex-RIC. By comparison, only 14 disbanded RIC men joined the Civic Guard, or an Garda Síochána, by mid-1924. And none of these appear to have served in North Tipperary. It was recorded in mid-1924 that 129 ex-RIC had joined the Civic Guard, the new police force. 104 of these, though, had resigned from the RIC during the War of Independence. 6 of them had been dismissed. And many of those who had resigned or been dismissed had actually joined the IRA in the interim. Disbanded men, much less willing, and I suppose probably much less welcome as well. The high proportion of men disbanded in North Tipperary who left Ireland likely points to an increased feeling of being unsafe there, whether that was justified or imagined. Much of the lethal violence against serving or ex-RIC in 1922 was in Munster counties, where the conflict had been most acute. In a place like Tipperary, a threatening letter or a warning had to be taken seriously, even by men who had stuck it out for the duration of the War of Independence. Ex-Sergeant John Lynch, for example, claimed that he ignored threats against him during the war, as I considered no one would resign except a coward. But the receipt of 2 threatening letters in June 1922 convinced him to leave his home in Neenah. Patrick Durkin admitted that when his home in Killinall was raided by armed men, he agreed to leave the area the next morning, as I knew well they would carry their threat into effect if I refused. Durkin did, though. He was back in Carrick-on-Shore by 1926. So the feeling of threat didn't last, for him at least. A sample of 163 Irishmen disbanded from the force in neighbouring Limerick shows that only 23 remained in the county in January 1923, while over 70% were collecting pensions at addresses in Britain. So in Limerick, there's a certain kind of rush almost from Limerick to Britain in particular. So you can even see the breakdown is different in Tipperary than it was for men disbanded in Limerick. Far fewer of the Limerick men went to Palestine, for example, than Tipperary men. I say by that I mean men who'd served in the county rather than men who were from the county. But this wider sense of threat was also regional. If you take a wider sample of about 6,000 Irish-born men who were disbanded, about 1/3 of them left initially and 2/3 of them stayed. And it's hard to fully verify these figures. The 1926 census would help to a large extent. But it's certainly the case that many of those who left initially returned to the Irish Free State at some point, often after the end of the Civil War. So theirs was a temporary exile. Someone like Patrick Durkin would be an example of that. And it does appear to be the case that it was generally easier or preferable to settle down in one's home county or the county of one's wife rather than in the county in which one had served. The last available nominal returns for the RIC in Tipperary North Riding were recorded on the 1st of January 1920 and the 1st of January 1921. The 1920 return lists a head constable, 2 sergeants and 13 constables stationed in Thurles RIC barracks on Friar Street. All had been born in Ireland and all had joined the RIC prior to 1917. The head constable, George Williams, who was a Protestant from Sligo, and Sergeant Patrick Hurley, who was a Cork-born Catholic, had been members since 1899 and 1888, respectively. The remainder had joined between 1893 and 1917. So this was a very experienced group of men, with a very significant number of men of long service and a very high number of Protestant constables, probably a disproportionate number of Protestant constables, it must be said. 6 of the 13. Williams was later promoted to 3rd and then 2nd District Inspector, and 7 of the 13 constables were promoted to Sergeant in 1920 or 1921. And their trajectories after 1920 highlight the variety of experiences for the RIC in the final years of the force and afterwards. 9 of the 16 were disbanded in 1922, though there had been significant movement in between. This was not necessarily unusual anyway, and was probably influenced as well by the nature of the conflict and by the high number of promotions. In total, 10 finished their careers in North Tipperary, though only 3 of the men were disbanded. 6 were disbanded elsewhere in Ireland, having transferred from Thurles to another county. 3 had died in 1920 or 1921, 1 from heart failure, 1 the result of an accidental shooting by auxiliaries in Limerick in 1921, and the other, Constable Luke Finnegan, was killed by the IRA in 1920. 2 of the men resigned in 1920, 1 apparently to emigrate and the other to take a position in Scotland. Sergeant Patrick Hurley was able to retire in 1921 before the end of the War of Independence, and he collected his pension in Roscrea, which suggested that he was able to settle down there. But he was alone amongst these men in remaining in Tipperary. Presumably he had some level of personal popularity in the area over the course of his long service, or at least he hadn't drawn the wrong sort of attention on himself. 1 Thurles policeman who didn't manage to keep himself out of trouble seems to have been Humphrey Cahill. Cahill had joined in 1913 and spent his career in North Tipperary until he was transferred to Gormanston Camp in January 1922. He was stationed in Thurles. He was disbanded in April from Gormanston. He seems to have had an active War of Independence. He'd been promoted to sergeant in January 1921 and then received 3 favourable records between March and August. He left after disbandment for London and then went to South Boston. He received £100 from the RIC tribunal because he was considered to be in special danger, both in Britain and in Ireland, so he went to the United States. The list for the 1st of January 1921 reflects a complete shift in the makeup of the men serving in Thurles Barracks. Only 3 remained from the 1920 list, one of whom was Humphrey Cahill. The other 2 happened to both be Protestants, were Andrew Jackson and John Pratt. Both were disbanded and Pratt returned to his home county of Cavan while Jackson went to the United States. And again, we know this kind of immediately, what they did in the decades afterwards. Obviously, I can't say at this point anyway. There had been a substantial expansion of the garrison to 44 men, made up of a new head constable, 3 new sergeants and 40 constables. These 40 were almost all either men who had joined between 1914 and 1918 or black and tans recruited in 1920. The latter of these made up 26 of the total, so you had a significant number of black and tans in Thurles Barracks. 6 of the Irish pre-1920 recruits went to Palestine after disbandment, and this is a particularly high proportion from one barracks. So this points likely to a strong peer influence that existed amongst these men, in the sense a number of them followed each other over to Palestine, and you know, the kind of influence of peers on decisions that were made after 1922. All of the 6 were single men, which perhaps made it easier to go to Palestine, with the exception of one sergeant. The sergeant was also single, but he'd been a member since 1900. The rest of them had been men of short service, so therefore they had smaller pensions, so the desire to keep working was perhaps strong. Ultimately, most Irish-born disbanded policemen stayed in Ireland after retirement or disbandment, or returned after a short period away. And I think it is significant that so many did return, particularly after 1923 or after the end of the Civil War. And the receptions that they received in the Irish Free State could be mixed, dependent to some extent on the individual and on the locality to which they returned. Some policemen found themselves at the mercy of local suppliers, and could be forced to pay over the odds for goods or services. Francis Ronan, who was originally from County Clare, was disbanded in Sligo in 1922. He described how we pay the highest price for everything and pay ready money or starve. Another despairing ex-RIC man pointed out in June 1922 that the feeling of the people is such that compensation granted is of little avail. For those who had to travel either within Ireland or beyond, the experience of having to uproot was traumatic enough, but families often found it difficult to secure means of transporting their goods, with neighbours either unwilling or afraid to help. Property could also be stolen or destroyed while in transit, and one disbanded policeman went as far as painting over the standard RIC bottle green boxes which were holding his property in the hope that they would be left alone. Social ostracism could be more subtle, though no less effective potentially. During a series of meetings in February 1922 with the representative bodies of the RIC, the Chief Secretary was told that police families had been threatened with eviction since the truce. The children of policemen had been insulted at school. Limerick County Council had debarred the children of RIC from eligibility for its scholarships, and the wife of a police officer had her school boycotted, forcing its closure. And this is the record of the minutes of the decision that was made to bar ex-RIC from applying to the County Council scholarships. The only query about it was whether it should apply to retired RIC men as well, and they decided to leave it as it was. There was no decision to allow them into the remit. In April 1923, the GAA's Central Council received a letter from a club secretary inquiring about ex-RIC men receiving pensions and if such men were eligible to play hurling and football. It was resolved to make them eligible until such time as the President could make inquiries about the source of their pensions. This doesn't appear again in the minutes of the Central Council, so I'm not sure what they actually did. I assume they did nothing. But the query is interesting in its own right. The record of an individual policeman could dictate their fate, as it were, after disbandment, but this was applied somewhat arbitrarily. Dennis Harrington and Florence Donnelly had been stationed in Patrickswell in County Limerick. They moved into the Kerry No. 2 Brigade area, and inquiries were made about their record. The Director of Intelligence reported that Harrington was one of the old peelers who were sticking on. Patrickswell was a very quiet area, and it's quite possible that he might not be so quiet if the area were more vigorous. I would, however, recommend that he be allowed to reside in Ireland. The same remarks D. Harrington would apply to Florence Donnelly. And for others, though, it seems just having been a member of the force could be enough to bring trouble. During the raid on the home of one man, one ex-RIC sergeant, his wife was informed that the raiders had come to shoot him because he was a servant of the Crown. But for every man threatened, beaten or shunned, there were those who experienced little or no hostility in their communities, and they're much harder to track. And that's where the oral history interviews are particularly important. In the case of all 9 sons and daughters that we've interviewed, their father had been disbanded from the RIC. 5 left Ireland immediately on disbandment, though 3 of them eventually returned after a period away. One interviewee told how her father went to Galway City after disbandment, where he was not known, and he felt unable to return to the family farm a few miles outside the city for 2 years. Another interviewee's father went to England before returning, coincidentally also, to Galway in June 1923 after the Civil War to take up a farm that he'd inherited from an uncle. A third went to Liverpool, then back to Belfast, where he'd been disbanded in 1922, and again coincidentally settled in Galway around 1930. Of the 2 who stayed away, one settled and married in New Zealand, and the other, a married man in 1922, moved to London and remained there for the rest of his life. The latter of these was the highest ranking. He joined as a cadet and ultimately served as an acting county inspector. And he was, perhaps more significantly, later accused, along with 2 of his brothers, who were also in the RIC, of the killing of a postmaster in County Meath. One of the brothers hadn't joined until after this particular killing, but all 3 were later suggested to have been involved. They possibly were, they possibly weren't. This man was also involved in prosecutions arising from the famous rescue of Sean Hogan, and not long. And a reputation like that could ultimately have a significant bearing, and it probably influenced his decision to stay away from Ireland. He was in London for 4 years before he got work with the Milk Marketing Board. Our interviews do reflect the records, in the sense that, you know, there's a clear pattern of men who remained in the Irish Free State going back to their home county or the county of their wife rather than staying in the county that they'd served. Some of them went to Dublin as well. Only one man discussed in our interviews remained in the place that he'd served, or one, just specifically referring to the children. And as it happens, this man stayed in care. His son, who grew up in care, however, strongly suspected that his father may have been an inside man for the IRA, or was at least on good terms with local Republicans. He remembered being told that his father was the only policeman in the area who went home to bed every night and never got shot. He had apparently prevented some prominent local IRA men from being arrested and potentially killed. And this story was told to this man by a former member of the IRA in the area rather than by his father himself. And there are stories emerging in these testimonies of ex-RIC men having good relations with local IRA men in the 1920s, 1930s. Some of them had family or connections to the IRA as well. And this is not at all unusual, even in the case where somebody maybe wasn't actively helping the IRA during the War of Independence. And I think returning to a place where you were known via family rather than via what you'd actually done in the RIC might have been significant. These interviews also give us some pictures of what men did for careers after the RIC. Some retired or disbanded men were able to live off pensions alone after 1922, but most either needed to continue working or chose to do so. 2 of the fathers of the interviewees moved to the north and joined the RIC. Both of these were Catholics, and in one case a brother also joined with him. This is the RIC service card of one of the fathers of one of the men that we interviewed. For the rest, there were careers as shopkeepers, publicans, clerical work of various kinds. And the numbers who appear to have taken on careers that required local customers to visit them and were able to do so is particularly striking. Now, this is a self-selecting group of interviewees, I suppose, and the story is ultimately very positive, which is in kind of contrast to the written record, which tends to be much more negative, because it's based around compensation records and complaints. But given the fact that the RIC was very much on the wrong side of the War of Independence from the point of view of the new state, and given the reputation that the Black and Tans accrued, The overwhelming picture that emerges is one where ex-RIC men, and these are Irish-born ex-RIC men, were able to settle down quietly and relatively peacefully. Interviewees universally reported little or no discrimination, ostracism or ill treatment directed at their RIC relatives or at themselves as RIC families. The man who stayed in care recalled being called a peeler at one point and somebody told him to put a stop to it. He also remembered being sent on long errands during school time, and then he later learned that it was while the teacher wanted to talk about the black and tans. They kind of sent him out of the room basically until they were finished the history lesson. But again, he went to school there and generally got on quite well. And this isn't because, an RIC past was a closely kept secret. Rather, it was often something that was well known within the community. A number of the children we interviewed described being called names at school, as I said. One recalled her brother being called a peeler's son. But this was usually remembered as children being children rather than anything more sinister. And I mentioned the interview who grew up in care. The son of the ex-RIC man who returned to Galway to run a pub in the 1930s had a brother who had, this man who'd been in the IRA, or in the RIC, also had a brother who'd been in the IRA. And his son recalled that his father was the subject to the occasional dig from other local publicans about the fact that he was in the RIC and they were in the IRA and that, but he always evaded it. Another interviewee described more substantial trouble, being called black and tans at school and a reticence from his father to deal with it directly. But he also described how his older brother, who was 6'2" in height, was able to take on anybody in school and scared the crap out of them. I wasn't as lucky, my younger brother wasn't as lucky. We were from time to time prevented from playing sports during recess, but that would depend on who the schoolyard bully was. And being a good hurler, as this interviewee was, apparently helped in warding off the bullies. Being good at hurling goes a long way in certain parts of the country. The pre-war War of Independence RIC was overwhelmingly made up of Irish-born Catholics who would have considered themselves Irish nationalists of some shade or other. Our interviewees almost always considered themselves and their families nationalist, though the interviews point to a strong tendency amongst ex-RIC to support Cummin Ale and its successor Fine Gael. There's a real family tradition that seems to have gone through and a lot of the people we're interviewing. And as early as April 1922, this is a cartoon by Grace Gifford, who became Grace Plunkett, where she is basically criticising the Free State, saying the Free State is being propped up by ex-RIC, ex-unionist, job hunters, oath breakers, truce volunteers. The ex-RIC have been lumped into this bracket. And there was a certain perception that Cummin Ale and then Fine Gael were sort of the party of ex-RIC and ex-loyalists and ex-unionists. And there's some truth in that, in the sense that there is this tradition that where we can figure out the political allegiances of an ex-RIC man or his family, it tended to be more likely to be Cummin Ale. Lots of them said they weren't very political as well. Allegiances could be complicated, but a number of the grandchildren we interviewed would have said they still voted Fine Gael, and this was the kind of family tradition. I'll keep my thoughts on that to myself, given that time of year it is and where I am. But interestingly, even where there was cases where they said, well, the family wasn't very political, there's lots of dislike for Fianna Fáil and Eamon de Valera. And I think a lot of the support for Cummin Ale was based on support for the treaty. They saw Cummin Ale as the party of the treaty, and I suppose later on the party of law and order. And even in families described as not overtly political, Eamon de Valera often appears as this bogeyman. He hated de Valera, no time for de Valera, couldn't stand de Valera. And there might be an assumption that ex-RIC men and the generations that followed them would wish to keep their RIC history quiet. That making it known might bring trouble or even might be embarrassing or shameful. And while that was perhaps the case for some, and obviously not the case for the kind of people who came forward to give us interviews, the family narratives that we've gathered suggest the silences weren't as obvious as you might think. Many interviewees describe some reticence within the family to advertise their RIC past openly, but they're also clear that it was well known within the local community, as evidenced by the playground taunts that I mentioned. RIC fathers or grandfathers or their wives seem to have spoken relatively little about RIC service, but didn't necessarily say nothing at all. One daughter recalled a vague feeling of difference and a requirement for reticence around the subject of her father's career. But younger interviewees who only knew their fathers or grandfathers as children were likely to suggest that they were simply not inclined to ask questions, being interested in other things, or in some cases not having that sort of relationship that might lend itself to long discussions about the past. While some interviewees, particularly grandchildren, indicated that they would perhaps prefer not to have had RIC service in the family, there's very little sense of embarrassment or shame. A number of RIC children specifically stated that their father showed no regret at their service, but rather pride, and that word was used repeatedly. In some cases, RIC service was mentioned in obituaries, and in one instance recorded on a headstone. It should be noted, however, that none of these men were said to be involved in killings or reprisals during the War of Independence, and pride at RIC service could be combined with a dislike for the Black and Tans. One interviewee described the difficulty she had in reconciling the man she knew as her father, a man who abhorred fighting and military activity, with the reputation of the Black and Tans, complaining directly that the Tans had sullied the reputation of RIC men like her father. Another reflected that there was probably a lot of good people in the RIC who resented the Black and Tans every bit as much as my father did, and almost everybody else did. And now all of this is in some respects the nature of the project, and it was an open call and people volunteered to come forward. And those who might be embarrassed or ashamed, are not likely to respond in that way. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that there's no stigma or shame either existing within families or within communities. But certainly there's enough in what we're gathering to tell us that this is not universal. And the interviewees point to the extent to which it was possible to live next to political enemies of the War of Independence and carry on regardless. A certain tolerance for those who ended up on the wrong side of the conflict, and if perhaps not quite a willingness to forget, then a willingness to forgive, to reconcile, to ignore the past, or just to tolerate it. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.